I'm no good at taking good advice, and I'm self-careless, so don't tell me twice that lately I've been so stuck in my head that I forget just about everything my therapist said. Maybe I'm self-helpless. Maybe I'm self-helpless. Maybe I'm self-helpless. Maybe we are all self-helpless.
Hey everyone, welcome to Self-Helpless. I'm Delanie Fischer, and today I'm joined by Bill Burke, who is the founder of the Optimism Institute and host of Blue Sky Podcast. And Bill created his platform to combat the negative effects of news and social media on mental health. And during this episode, we discuss what optimism is and what it's not. Optimism can often get lumped into the same category as toxic positivity. And Bill makes it very clear that being an optimist doesn't mean that you're not informed. It doesn't mean that you're not saddened or angered by injustice. Being an optimist just means that although there's a lot of shitty things happening, you believe that you can actually do something about it, that you can make the world a better place in some way, shape, or form. And being an optimist inspires you into action versus becoming stagnant in defeat. And really to not use pessimism as an excuse to not take any action at all, or even using it to absolve oneself of responsibility. And a big theme as well during this episode is even when there are tough moments or periods of time, what happens when we zoom out and look at our evolution as a whole? We are finding that we are progressing, even if it sometimes does not seem like that or feel like that. I really enjoy the way Bill uses history to become more optimistic. I think history can be used in a lot of different ways, sometimes to spread fear, anger, division. And this was just a really good spin on those narratives. And this balance of using history as a tool to learn from and also to become hopeful about our future. We also talked about if there are any health benefits to becoming more optimistic, real life examples of what optimism can look like, and even if optimism has been necessary for our survival as a species. Also, for all my quote lovers, this episode is full of juicy quotables. Bill is quite the quote king, so that was really fun too. Anyway, here is my chat with Bill Burke. What is your definition of optimism? And does it differ from a definition maybe somebody might find, in a dictionary or Google? I guess dictionaries aren't really a thing anymore.
Yeah.
Or is it pretty kind of straightforward to what the definition is?
Well, I might have a little bit of a wrinkle to it, but I say
Okay.
that an optimist is someone who believes that tomorrow will be better than today and that they have a role to play in making it so. I add the role to play. I think some people see optimism as this sort of naive, silly, just sit back and things are going to get better. And I don't see it that way. And one of the reasons I'm passionate about this is I think that optimism can create activity and get out and do things as opposed to pessimism, which if you think the cause is lost, why bother? It's yeah, Henry Ford said whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. And so I
Yes.
think we have to stay active in our optimism. So that's probably the wrinkle that I would add.
I love that you add the action piece onto it because I do think it gets confused with toxic positivity, the just think happy thoughts mentality. So you mentioned one misconception about optimism. Are there other misconceptions that you'd like to address that people have about optimism or optimistic behavior?
I don't know if it's a perception, but the old often if you mention optimism or if you Google it or run it through AI, you get the whole glass half full, half empty, which I hate.
Mm.
Is the glass half full or the glass half empty? First of all, it's just kind of silly. Yeah, some people are wise guys. Say, well, it's half air, half water. My thing is that an optimist would look at that glass, enjoy it, and then go fill it up again. It's like
I
it's
love that. Yes.
I would love to just get rid of the glass half empty, half full. That's probably a big one for me. And again, yeah, you said it. It's not toxic positivity. It's not being silly and foolish. I am the first to admit we've got all kinds of problems going on in this world. What I would add though is that we always have. I've coined a phrase that I'm working on developing, which is the paradox of modern optimism, which is homo for the young people, by the way. The paradox of modern optimism is that there's never been a better time to be alive, and yet there's never been a harder time to be optimistic. And so how do you square those two things? So that's kind of what my mission is evolving into.
I listened to several of your interviews, and you are just
Oh, thank you.
you're full of incredible quotes. I mean, you are like quote king over there. And
Thank you.
one that you mentioned, and you quote a lot of different people, which I love. I
Yeah.
love how you
None
bring
of
other
them are
people.
original for the most part.
You
Let's
know
just
what?
point that out.
But the one that you're working on seems pretty original.
Pomo, that's mine. Pomo,
I love
trademark,
Pomo.
TM. Yeah,
One of
thank
the
you.
quotes that really resonated was the, please correct me, but something like, "If you watch the news, you'll think
Yes,
things have never been worse, but if you read history, you'll realize things have never been better." Can you share a little bit
bingo.
about that perspective? Because I don't think we use history to become optimistic a lot of the time.
Thank you for bringing that up, 'cause that's one of the reasons I'm passionate about this. I've always been a history buff. I was a history major in college, and I read a lot of history, and I mean, it happens every day. When you hear someone say, "This country's never been more divided than we are today," so we did fight a civil war for 4 years and killed each other by the hundreds of thousands. The
Right.
summer of 1968 was horrific. These things have gone on forever. I read a Civil War book recently about a guy named Joshua Chamberlain, who was this hero for the Union. And they just sort of say in passing, yeah, and then their second of 3 children died in childbirth, as did their fourth. These things were just incredibly commonplace, and we take for granted that they're not today. And I think that's a mistake. We should appreciate how much progress we've made. I was honored to give a high school graduation speech to a small high school up in Maine. And I talked about when I was in high school, when I graduated, this will date me, it was 1984. And we had apartheid in South Africa. We had the Cold War was raging. We wouldn't go to the Moscow Olympics. The Russians wouldn't come to the LA Olympics. My generation whiffed on climate change. I'll admit that. But we were fighting acid rain and the ozone layer. And my point was, we've checked out, oh, and AIDS. We didn't have a name for it. It was killing people all over the country, primarily where I grew up near New York. We fixed all of those things for the most part. Apartheid, ozone layer. We listened to the scientists. We stopped using chloroform. So if you look at history, it's like we've had all kinds of problems that we fixed, and we've just got to get our act together and keep fixing the ones in front of us.
Why do you think every generation thinks that the world is ending? What's going on for us in the human brain?
Yeah, I
What
had
would
a
you
guy
say?
on named Adam Mastroianni, and I'll mess his theories up, but he's this brilliant guy. And he said every generation thinks they live in unprecedented times because they do live in unprecedented times. By definition, the time that you live is unprecedented. It's never happened before.
Right.
And so the challenges we face, we just always think no one's ever had it this bad. And this is what happens when you get older. I walked to school both ways uphill and it was snowing. It's just our brains do that. And he's got some very scientific reasons for it, but it's a factual thing. It's actually something we have to fight against. There's also a thing called hindsight bias. So the flip side is we look back and just think, oh, the good old days. It was so great back then. And it's like, well, really? Was it? Let's talk about that. In hindsight, we forget a lot of the bad stuff in our own personal lives. So you say, oh, I loved high school. And that's like, wait a second. Remember that time you were so bummed out about Susie didn't go to the dance with you? You forget a lot of those bad things. It's a coping mechanism that we have in our brains. So I like to quote Billy Joel, said the good old days weren't always good and tomorrow's not as bad as it seems. There's so much more positive today than we realize, and we tend to gloss over the negative things that happen in our own personal path.
That seem counterproductive? Wouldn't you want it the
Yes,
opposite? Like, you would like to
right.
think positively about now and the future and maybe think, "Oh,
Yeah.
look at what I overcome," but why is it the opposite? What's
Yeah, I
going
can't
on?
remember. Adam had a great explanation of that, and I'm embarrassed to say I can't totally remember it. But trying to say we're going to take you back to this time when everything was so wonderful is a very common device that politicians will use.
Yeah.
And this idea that we're going to take you back to the good old days of this, that, or the other. And then when you really look at it, it's like, well, they really weren't that great. Or which times are you talking about? Well, the 50s were great. Well, we did have Jim Crow in the 50s. We
Right.
just gloss over those things. It's frankly the class of people, the race of people who might have had it good back then, that gets distorted as well. So I think it's a
Yeah.
big mistake, though, to forget the challenges we had in the past because it makes today seem much worse than it is.
I like this idea of using history to be optimistic. What would you say to the people, though, that are worried we may repeat history if we don't use history to learn and grow from?
Yeah. I think they're right. I mean, I think you have to learn from history, and as they say, it doesn't always repeat, but sometimes it rhymes. And again, I'm not naive, and I'm not completely without worry about what could happen in this country, but I think it's important to keep things in context. And again, we have the benefit of history to learn from and
Yeah.
try to spot those mistakes that were made in the past. It's history can be incredibly instructive.
Great points. My grandparents both immigrated to America, and before they passed away, they shared all kinds of stories with us about what they lived through, whether it's several members of their family dying of tuberculosis, passing out gas masks on the way to school because of bombings.
Yeah.
I mean, hearing from them just gave me so much perspective growing up that I can get through whatever shit I'm dealing with, and I'm really grateful to have had that perspective. Um, and what also amazes me as they got older, the things they reflected on were surprisingly positive considering all the different challenges that they went through. And that was
Delaney,
really
it's
amazing to
I
witness.
remember early in the pandemic, I was living up in Maine, and I called a friend who's in New York, and you could like hear the sirens in the back. It's a really scary, awful time. I said, "How are you holding up?" He said, "Well, it helps that my mother-in-law is a Holocaust survivor
Wow.
because she's holed up in her apartment watching Netflix, thinking this really isn't so bad." Or when I spoke to that high school class, I was reflecting on my grandfather, my dad's side. He fought in World War One, and his oldest son, my uncle, fought in World War Two. His brother, my dad, fought in Korea. And my brother missed the Vietnam draft by 3 years. And this high school class isn't even thinking about the draft because we don't have one.
Right.
You know,
So how can we hold both things where we're grateful that some things are not as terrible as they used to be, but we're also realistic about the things that need to be improved upon? And how can we motivate ourselves into action versus getting stuck?
yeah, I think I will always advocate for acting and leaning in on the issues that you care about. I'm emphatically for that. Where I push back sometimes are with people who they obsess about things that frankly they can't have a lot of influence on. I have a friend during the campaign who said, "Can you believe what they said today? I can't believe what they said today." And I said, "Well, is this going to change who you vote for in November?" "No, I would never vote for that guy." It's like, then why are you letting it ruin your day? Get on with your day. He's gonna say something that upsets you tomorrow, and if you wanna knock on doors for the other candidate, do that, absolutely, but just obsessing about this comment that the person made that day is just not helpful. So I think some of it is, compartmentalizing these issues and getting on with your day and not having news alerts all day that remind you of that thing that upset you in the morning. That's one. Another thing I steal is Stephen Covey talks about the circle of concern, the circle of influence, and the circle of control. Circle of concern is a huge circle, so it's everything you're worried about. It's climate change, it's the war in Ukraine, it's what's going on in the Middle East and Sudan, and it's valid to be concerned about. But a lot of those things, to be honest, you can't do a whole lot about. I'm an empathetic person, so I'm concerned about it. Circle of influence is much smaller, but you can actually have an influence. So it's your family, it's your friends, it's your coworkers, and that's where I think you can really sort of move the needle with people. You've got a friend who's down and out and having a tough time, just lost their job, just lost a parent, whatever it is. Those are things too that you can be really active on and actually have an influence and make a difference. Circle of control is tiny. It's basically like yourself, and so I don't even focus too much on that. But your circle of
Yeah.
influence is really important, and you'll feel like you're actually accomplishing something because you are. And then sometimes when you do that too, there's ripple effects, and that circle of influence can actually grow. Okay, so if I make your day a little bit better, and then you make your friend's day a little bit better, then that influence has actually grown. Versus if I spend the day ruminating over something that's going on the other side of the world that I can't do much about, that's not great. I don't think that's helpful.
I talk a lot about this idea of everyday activism on the podcast a lot of like it doesn't
Yeah,
have to be all or nothing, and what are you
right.
already doing in your life or what do you already enjoy doing that you can maybe tweak a little to
Yeah,
maybe, help a little more people or align
yep,
better with what you believe in. And I think especially with technology and social media, we tend to think globally all the time and
all the time.
we'll miss the person that needs help at the grocery store, because we're thinking about
Exactly.
something across the world that we can't move there to solve. I think it's a great point that we can't let it overwhelm us or defeat us.
I think, Delanie, I think one of the things that we feel so exhausted and stressed all the time, and I'm guilty of this too, but if you, someone pointed out to me, if you think about the evolution of the human species, for until the last little bit of our history, we were concerned about like 5 square miles from where we lived.
Right.
We didn't know there was another town over there. If we did, we never interacted with it. We worried about our family. We worried about this local community, local, incredibly small local. We didn't know there was an earthquake in Haiti. We didn't know there was a
Exactly.
war going on in Africa. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be aware of these things and read the news and everything else, but we're not equipped to handle all of that. We have so much coming into our brains. One of the things I advise people to do is turn off the alerts on their phone. You're sitting there and it's, it's awful. We're recording this on a day there was a school shooting yesterday. That's awful. It's terrible. I'm worried about gun issues. I think it's an awful thing. There's not a lot I can actively do about it today. And to find out, there was no need for me to know that when it happened yesterday at 3 o'clock or whatever it was that I got. That I heard. So I walked by a TV that had it on the news. But my daughter, I guarantee it, she has her alerts on, and she was at work, and I guarantee it buzzed, and she looked at it and got really sad. I just don't think that's particularly helpful.
I've learned this too. Even if you personally become very boundaried around these things, I don't watch the news. I deleted all my social media a few years ago. I have tried to be conscientious about the kind of information I take in and when, but I still get text messages like, "Hey, did you hear about this thing?" It seems like there is some kind of enjoyment over sharing bad news, whether that is escapism or, a lot of people say that we've become addicted to stress or the desire to, inform everybody so people can stay safe. I'm assuming it's it's a survival mechanism to kind of like always be on,
Bingo.
on alert,
Yeah.
right?
Well, yeah, and it's interesting. I've heard different explanations for why we thrive on that and why news media, attracts eyeballs. One is this interest we have in negativity, but another gentleman, very uh, respected neuroscientist, Richie Davidson, was on my show, and he said we actually are where our brains are designed to detect difference and
Oh,
things that are unusual. And his point is bad things like this are actually quite unusual. That's why we respond to them.
oh, interesting.
That actually helps me because then you realize these are the exceptions. I respect your ability to get off social media. I challenge people. It's like, these are a lot of these are unforced errors. We don't have to let these things into our life. I can get annoyed with Facebook and Instagram, but it's like I signed up for it. So
Right. It's so interesting what you said that our brains are trained to find unusual activity. So I'm assuming that means both positive and negative stuff gets our attention. And now I'm thinking maybe my own bias or experience of negative topics, being shared or something, maybe those are more memorable to me. And it just feels like I'm exposed to those things a lot more. But maybe if I looked at my phone or I reflected on all the conversations that I have, maybe a mix of both, and maybe pretty even mix of both things.
yeah.
So I'm like gonna do a little
Yeah,
experiment.
that's a little project for you,
I'm
Delanie.
like, oh shit, I got trapped in my own
Well,
stuff.
yeah, or likewise. So I'm now living in New York City where my friends who don't live here will be like, "Do you feel safe? There was just a thing that happened on the subway last week." And it's like, well, there are 8 million people here and things are going to happen. And so what I do when I walk most places, because it's a very walkable city, I keep my AirPods off and everything. I just look around and I see someone, hey, can I pet your dog? And then I see someone who's lost and needs directions. And then I see someone drop something in the crosswalk and 5 people help them pick it up. And it's like everywhere. And again, the good things are commonplace. And unless you sort of open your aperture and intentionally look for it, you don't see it. And even in the news, I one of the things I love about the work I'm doing is that when I read the paper or go online, I'm looking for these great stories. And there's
Yeah.
way more of them than you realize, but you have to actively seek them out.
Kind of the concept of what you focus on grows. I mean, there's probably
Yeah.
equal amount of great stories and sad stories. And
Yeah.
where are you looking? Like, let's just say everything was 50-50 just for an experiment.
Yeah. Yeah.
That
Yeah.
leaves that leaves what's that kind of leaves it on you. what are
Yeah.
you going to look at, and how are you going to perceive things, and that's going to kind
Yeah.
of create your experience.
Right.
Do you think that optimism has also been kind of a survival tactic for us, like, because we talked about like early human days, right? Like
Yes.
if I'm an optimist back then, if I think I can find a body of water to drink from so I
Yeah.
don't get dehydrated, I'm going to
Right.
probably look for solutions and think of ideas to find one. But if I don't think
Yeah.
it's possible, I'm not going to, and then I'm not going to have any water. Do you think it was a survival thing that we
It's a
have
really
built
good
in?
question because I think possibly, but generally what you'll hear is that, and it's the reason we're hardwired this way. I don't even know if pessimism is the right word, but just cautious. We don't want to get killed by the lion. We don't want to
Right.
get by we had predators back then in ways that we don't now. It's more commonplace to be hungry for 5 days. So
Yeah.
there were more threats to us. We don't have animals chasing us. We're not,
Right.
literally.
Right.
So we were definitely there was definitely an evolutionary bias towards people who had some caution about and were prepared. But it's an interesting thought that maybe too that thing, well, maybe I can find water. I
Right.
wouldn't be surprised if there was some of that. And definitely throughout history, this is another bias of mine, but I think it holds up. People who have made a huge difference in the world, they were all optimists. I interviewed a guy named Burke Jacobs who, with his brother, founded Life is Good, the apparel company that's all about optimism. And he says, I love challenging people. Bring me the list of history's great pessimists.
Great point. Yes.
He's like, I've yet to get one. It's just, and leaders, you don't follow somebody who says, follow me, I'll take you someplace worse. It's just,
Yeah.
so I do think that the world has moved forward and has been improved by optimists for sure. In that, I'm very confident.
There's so many kind of definitions that get clumped together, right? Toxic positivity and optimism and
Yes.
happiness, and then also pessimism and or
Yeah.
being realistic. Can
Yes.
you maybe share a little bit about that? Like, where does one start and one end, and what are some
Yeah.
differences we need to be aware of?
Pessimism, back to my definition of optimism, I think a lot of pessimists think that tomorrow's going to be worse. Today's worse than it's ever been. Tomorrow's probably going to be even worse. That's my own take on pessimism. And then often, one of the reasons I got into this work, I have kids, and at the time when I started, both in their late 20s, one just turned 30, um, with friends who say, I don't want to have kids because the world's going to end in 30 years because of climate change. Okay, well, if I okay, but if I conclude that the world's going to end in 30 years for climate change, why would I drive a smaller car or drive a why would I bother? Let's
Right.
just hang out and we're all going to be gone in 30 years. So to me, that's a terrible place to get. Um, People ask me about realism. I think you have to have some realism in your life. Although that same Bert Jacobs, he said realists lack imagination, which is kind of interesting. But I think, even let's go back to leadership. I think optimism is vital in leadership, but at the same time, you have to be realistic. If I said I'm going to start a semiconductor company tomorrow with my team here, hey team, we're going to be worth more than Nvidia in a month. That's just silly. That's not realistic. So it has to be tempered with some realism. Toxic positivity to me almost moves into sort of a thoughtlessness and a not naivete, but just not really thinking. So the examples I always think of is someone's diagnosed with cancer and it's like, oh, it could be worse. It could be lung cancer,
Oh
but at
gosh.
least you've got a
Yeah.
good doctor. Some of the things people say when people are going through tough times is just, or in the workplace, and that's where a lot of the great writing's been done. And I wasn't great at this as a boss, where it's always just tell people how great they're doing, and in the review, gloss over the bad stuff, and then you're just not. That you're being positive, but it's not helpful. It's
Yeah.
helpful if I say, you know what, Delaney, this is the issue. You're doing great, but you really need to work on X, Y, Z. That's being helpful. If
Right.
I just said you have nothing to work on, you're amazing. That's kind of toxic and not helpful.
And you're doing the person a great disservice. Like, they don't have the opportunity
Totally.
to learn or grow or respond or
Exactly.
ask questions. So yeah, like that. I feel like constructive criticism is kind of a good example of like a good mix of
Exactly.
optimism and realism. And,
Yeah.
it's like kind of it seems like you just have to have a balanced approach
Yeah.
on this kind of spectrum of taking action, trying to improve things, and also, it's okay to be sad about how things are, but don't let it get
Right.
you so bogged down that you think it's all pointless.
Yeah, and I think some of that toxic positivity even leaked into has leaked into parenting sometimes, where it's just
Oh,
like little
yeah.
Johnny can do no wrong, and we used to joke about it. My parents are pretty tough, and yeah, if there was a problem with a teacher, they assumed the teacher was right. Versus, I think a lot of parents now, it's like, oh, I don't know, this teacher seems really hard on little Johnny, and it's like, well, maybe Johnny needs a little bit of, right?
Yeah.
There's there.
Yeah.
Again, now I sound like an old guy, get off my lawn. But I do think it's in child rearing. It's like, you gotta. There are times you need some tough feedback.
Mhm.
Um, I bristle when people say, "Oh, optimists just think everything's always hunky dory." I don't. That's not part of my definition. The other thing
Right.
you mentioned happiness, and that's a really interesting one. I think I'm not a huge fan of a lot of the happiness literature. I think that it creates a false expectation that we're always supposed to be happy. One of my favorite expressions, and I don't know who said it, but they said one of the secrets of happiness is not always stopping to wonder if you are. I think we do a lot of navel gazing about, geez, I'm not happy. I should be happy. And I think social media, like a lot of things, it throws gas on that fire because a young person goes to college. They agonize over the college decision. They go to a college and they have a bad day. They go on social media, and everyone on social media is having a great day at a different college. They probably aren't, but that's what you put on social
Right.
media.
Right.
And so, gosh, I'm not happy. There's something wrong. I'm not happy. What do I need to do to be happy? Maybe I should transfer. And it's that I think can be really insidious. So it'd always be helpful if my wife were on some of these interviews because she'd be like, he is not always happy or optimistic, frankly. It's not, you're going to have your ups and downs. And that's
Right.
that I worry that some people feel like, you got to be happy all the time at your job. You got to be happy all the time at home. It's not going to work that way. And it'll get worse if you expect it to work that way, in my opinion.
I would love your thoughts on this because sometimes I feel this way too. And like to speak for myself, I'm so grateful that my basic needs are met, food, water, and shelter, like
Amazing.
that's met. So it's almost like my brain finds other things to worry about because I'm not busy finding the food, water, and shelter. And it's almost like, do you think that we're so in our heads because we have more time on our hands to worry about shit versus we used to just have to do, survive, survive, survive. And now we're just thinking about
100%.
it.
I think you're 100% right. And today, if you talk to people who do work in countries that are poor, they'll say you'll often find some of the happiest people you've ever met. And they're grateful for everything they have. They don't sit around and they're not on social media.
Right.
They're not wallowing in self-pity. Frankly, they're not worried about what's happening on the other side of the world. A lot of these things we talked about, it's not in their lives. And some of the brightest smiling faces you'll ever see are in places where you think, boy, they've got it really tough.
Yeah.
Um, and they do, but there's this, in my view, it's a luxury to be able to sit around and worry about whether or not you're happy.
That's what I was kind of getting at. Like, wow, I
Totally.
mean, when I think about my dad started working at 13 years old because he had to help his mom pay rent. And he didn't think about what job's going to make me the most passionate. And how can I be
Exactly.
creative, right? He had to get a paper route because that's the only person who would hire him, right? And
Right.
so I have this awareness of, gosh, I am so lucky and grateful that I
Yes.
have been able to kind of craft a career that really brings me a lot of joy and all these things that not everybody has the privilege to do. Yet I still catch myself like, oh gosh,
Sure.
I'm feeling a bit sad today. And
Sure.
and I'm like, and then I feel kind of torn, like I'm beating myself up for feeling sad, but then I'm also realizing, okay, it's a human experience. And then I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm in my head again. If I lived 100 years ago, I wouldn't be in my head about
Yeah.
this shit. So
Yeah, it's hard.
it's just this weird thing. I don't know, the way that we have
Yeah.
evolved, we like our brains are obviously dealing with a lot of novelty, I
Yep.
guess.
Yep.
I'm curious, you kind of mentioned something about not always being optimistic. What is something that you would like to become more optimistic about in your own life or, the world or whatever you might be going through?
Yeah, it's a great question. I do worry. I love this country, and I'm a student of its history, and I do worry about some of the trends we're seeing right now. And I worry about. I'm not a huge fan of social media, and I'm in a funny spot now because I use it for my business. Basically, I don't have a marketing budget, so I try to reach people through social media. I worry about bad actors on social media coming in and messing with it, and we know it's happened where they've literally been trying to divide us and get people
Yeah.
drummed up. I think that's a real threat, and that genie is kind of out of the bottle, and how we bring it back. I do worry about that. That's
Yeah.
something I haven't seen a clear solution to that and how people can find news sources that they can trust. So those are probably the biggest for me. Um, and honestly, I get concerned about pessimism and cynicism. I
Yeah.
just see it so rampant, and I worry about young people. When I see polls, we're a country where for generations, every generation thought they were going to have it better than the one before, and they did. We now have significant polling where we have young people say, "I think it's going to be worse than my parents had it," and that I think can be self-fulfilling and really dangerous. And so that's one of the reasons I'm passionate about the work I'm doing now. Back to the luxuries we have. I mean, there's the classic of like the person on the airplane who's upset because the internet's cutting in and out. It's like, I'm sorry, you're on an airplane traveling 400 miles an hour. How the hell they even get internet on there in the first place? It's
Right.
like, how about take a nap, read a book, like we used to do. So,
Right.
we have
Right.
and by the way, like right now, Delaney, you and I are talking over Zoom in real time. I mean, this is the Jetsons. I mean, when I was a kid, it was like,
Yeah.
video. Oh, come on, you're not gonna have a video phone call. People are walking around the streets FaceTiming. It's a freaking miracle. It's
I've
amazing.
Yes, I still can't believe that I can do work that I really care about without having to leave my home. It really is amazing what opportunities exist now. And I can still get stuck in the negative thought spirals and all of that, but I can usually catch myself pretty quick and switch to gratitude these days instead of getting wrapped up in that type of kind of downward spiral
Yeah.
thing. Are there benefits to being optimistic? Are there health
Yes.
benefits, mental,
Yes.
emotional? Why should people care about this?
100%. The headlines are optimists live up to literally like 30% longer than people who don't have that kind of attitude. And it
Wow.
probably, I think it trickles through all kinds of things. So your blood pressure, your mental health can improve because you're focused on more positive things. You're actively reaching out to help other people. There's tons of evidence that that is a positive to your health. So there's a lot of reasons. Again, in the workplace, people in leadership positions tend to be optimists or they wouldn't be there. So if you want to get ahead in work, you can sit around the water cooler and kvetch and complain, or you can be positive. Okay, this stinks. You know what? You're right. This is really tough. What are we going to do about it? How are we going to fix this? How are we going to make it better? You're going to get promoted. You're going to do better at work. I think it helps you in a lot of different ways. You're going to be better company. You're stuck at a dinner party next to somebody. Do you want them to? I always use the Eeyore or Tigger. Tigger might get on your nerves by the end of the meal, but I'd rather sit next to Tigger than somebody that's, "Oh, here's another did you read the news today?" It's like, who wants that?
Right. Right.
So I just think, you're better company. I think there's a ton of benefits. And you mentioned gratitude there too, and that's a word I haven't used much in this conversation, but I'm all about it. I think that there's a very tight connection between gratitude and optimism. If you take time to realize all the things that you have to be grateful for, it sets you up to be more optimistic about what could be ahead because you're not taking for granted all these positives, your family, your pets, your coworkers, your house of worship if you have one, the people you hang out with, your neighborhood. You can start with a base of gratitude. Then you can say, okay, I've got this base under me. Again, like
Yeah.
what we're doing now was popularized during the pandemic.
Yeah.
And the pandemic was awful and people lost lives and it set people back and it messed up education. But the things that came out of it, a lot of them are amazing, but
Right.
but what had happened, it became political, we still fight about it, and now we're off living mostly normal lives, and we take it all for granted, and I think that's a big mistake.
We almost forget what we've been able to overcome. And you mentioned something that really resonated with me. Before the pandemic, this podcast was recorded at a studio in the Los Angeles area. And because of that, we were pretty limited to the guests we could have on. They had to be local or they had to be willing to travel to LA. And the pandemic forced the podcast to go virtual with the recordings. And it just opened up the entire world for guests. I mean, they can live anywhere and work anywhere and be on the podcast. And that may have never happened without that kind of experience.
Incredible.
And so, yeah, what are your favorite tips for somebody who's tuning in right now and they're aware that they're caught in negativity, maybe a certain thought loop or just in general, they kind of lean
Yeah.
negative or pessimistic, but they're having a hard time thinking or doing differently. What are some things, like simple things they can maybe do today or this week to start a
Yeah.
different shift, you know?
Yeah. Great question, and not an easy one. I think one though is to break whatever that cycle is again and start thinking about the things you're grateful for. I think that's a big one. If it's something sort of in society, think about, okay, what was that issue like 50 years ago, 100 years ago? How did we get to a place that's arguably that much better about it? I heard an expression recently, which is action absorbs anxiety. So, is there something you can do about it? This issue that you're ruminating about. If there's not, someone also said if it's out of your control, it should be out of your mind. Now that's easier said than done. But if it's something you just can't control, okay, fine. How can I put that out of my mind and just either live with it or stop thinking about it? It's not an easy thing to do. Ask yourself, why do I keep ruminating about this? Is it in my social media feed? Is it something that I'm just allowing myself to bathe in? Am I turning on cable news at night because I just like beating myself over the back and listening to people yell about something? Um, and is there a healthy break? I am not good about this, so this is more do as I say, not as I do. But I'm a big believer in a digital Sabbath. And a lot of people now there's a
Yeah,
movement to just take a day on the weekend, Saturday, Sunday, whatever it is, put it away. See how you feel.
right.
The first thing you're gonna notice is it's scary how addicted we are. It's bizarre.
Yeah,
It is like getting in the elevator. Oh my God, I'm not checking my phone. I mean, these things you just do automatically um, that really aren't that healthy. Thinking about how we used to consume news, for example. Remember growing up, and even in my early adulthood, read the paper in the morning, maybe two papers, go to work. No news during work. Maybe someone would run down the hall. Oh, some famous actor died, whatever. Very rarely was your day interrupted by quote unquote breaking news. Go home, maybe watch the nightly news, maybe not, and get up and do it again. You'll find if you take a day off from the news or even a week, I did that once. You come back, you didn't miss much. It's all sort of stuff, but we're all these little data points during the day that it's just really helpful. There's all kinds of blocking apps now too that are good. Block social media from 9 in the morning to 5 in the afternoon. Um, Literally lock boxes for your phone. I actually agree with Jonathan Haidt, who's the guy who wrote Anxious Generation. I don't think kids need smartphones in school. Um, I I don't think it's fair to teachers. I don't think it's good for their brains. So all those things, I think there's a real movement happening there. The first thing, it's like anything else. First thing is to be aware that you're doing it and
yeah,
just call a timeout and say, okay, why am I doing this? Is this in my control? Is this important?
yeah,
That I think is a
absolutely.
is a good first step.
Well, you brought up my next question, which
Yeah, let's
is
go.
which is so some people are aware like, "Oh shit, I feel like I know that I'm stuck in this like negativity." Some people are not aware that
No.
they lean negative. And so
Yeah.
how can you encourage somebody to kind of start to audit their own thoughts or behaviors so they can become
Yeah.
aware and say, "Oh my gosh, I am leaning like 80% negative throughout my day." And so I mean, how can somebody kind of start to
Yeah.
keep track of that?
That's a really good one. And I mean, I use a paper, journal to do. I use the bullet journal method, which I love. But I think literally write it down. Be less negative. Just put it in your to-do list. Put a post-it on your computer, something like that. I also think, and I'm encouraging people to be more optimistic in 2025. Make it a New Year's resolution, that kind of thing. It's proven that if you're going to work out, if you say I'm going to run a marathon or I'm going to lose 20 pounds, I'm going to join the gym. Having a running partner and accountability. If you say I'm going to run at 5:30 tomorrow morning, it's really easy to roll over when the alarm clock. It's a lot less easier to roll over if there are five people waiting for you at the meeting spot. So if you say to someone, "Hey, Delanie, you're my friend, you're my coworker. Give me a hard time if I start being really negative. I want you to be my accountability partner. Hey, you want to join me in seeing if we can be more optimistic? So when you bring in some negativity from outside, I'm going to call you on it. We'll have some fun with it." I think having an accountability partner in anything in life is really helpful.
Yeah.
Um, to have somebody else who's got your back or sort of gently saying, "Hey, there you're doing it again." My wife does that for me. Be like, "Oh, aren't you
Yeah.
the optimism guy?" You know, it's like, oh, I think that's one of the benefits of this work. I used to work at the Weather Channel. And if I came to work wet, that was bad because that meant I didn't look at the forecast and use an umbrella. So
Oh my gosh, that's so good. Gosh, I don't know, I don't remember where I heard this, but I know there was a some kind of method somebody used where they wore a bracelet and they would put the bracelet on their left hand, and if they caught themselves complaining, they would have to like move it to their right hand and start
ah,
all over. And so the
love
whole
that.
goal was to like keep the bracelet on the left hand, meaning you're
There you
not
go.
complaining, you're not negative, or at least you're catching yourself and you're switching it. It wasn't about like toxic positivity, but
Yeah,
the goal was like 30 days of keeping the bracelet on the same hand or something. I'm like,
yeah,
wow, that is such a fun little hack that it's a little bit of external accountability, but if somebody can't find a buddy, they can kind of do it for themselves, and it's this tool.
yes.
Um,
I guarantee you too. People listening, if you don't use, and now Apple's got it on the iPhone. I assume there's one on the Android. The screen time calculators. You ask someone how much time you on social media a day? Oh, an hour. I don't know, 45 minutes.
oh boy,
The numbers are staggering. Mine surprise. I mean, blow you away.
yeah,
And if you stop and think about, gosh, what would I do with those 5 hours?
right,
What could I do that would be positive and productive? Or people think they're multitasking. All the research shows that multitasking is largely a myth. If you've got social media up while you're doing your homework or whatever, you're doing neither very well. You're not that sort of being in the flow and being in a zone. That's a real thing that most, I think, neuroscientists would tell you that's a real thing. And so this myth of multitasking is another thing we could work on to make us feel better.
yeah. And we're kind of talking about technology. I've recently realized like I am watching way too much TV. Maybe I'm off social media, but I am watching
Yeah.
way too much TV, and I became aware of it and like, wow, TV used to be what, a few channels, there'd be a couple,
Yeah.
hit shows, and you'd have to wait like the next day or the next week before it came out or
Yeah.
something, right? Now it's
Yeah.
just everywhere all the time. You could watch
Everything.
TV all day every day. And so it's a big goal of mine to just watch way less TV, and I've been doing it the last
Yeah.
few days. I already feel immensely better. I feel like
Yeah.
I'm taking better care of myself naturally. I'm not feeling as overwhelmed. Like these things that have just been so normalized for us can also impact the kind of optimism we may or may not be experiencing, because I feel so much
Totally.
more optimistic about my days knowing that I have basically half my life back after work, you know?
Right. Right. No,
So it's
now it's like, yeah,
interesting.
like you said, you'd be like, you'd wait for Thursday night for Seinfeld to come on. Now I could go home and watch every single Seinfeld episode. And you know what it's like. Someone will say, "Oh, you got to
Yes.
stream the show." "Oh, really? Was it good?" "Yeah, it's good." It doesn't get really good till like episode 5. So
Right.
it's okay. So now I got to spend like 4 hours to get to the good part. But I could do that tonight.
Yeah. Yes,
And
exactly.
people do it. It's like, and again, it's like the best of times and the worst of times. That is an incredible luxury. What a world that I can go home and just hit a few buttons and watch an old classic movie or watch Moana or whatever. That's incredible, but it's
Right.
also fraught with peril if we just sort of sit back and let it happen.
Yeah, definitely, and it's kind of like the awareness of this is really cool, and also it's designed to be super addictive, and how can I
Yep.
somewhere fall in the middle? I'm not depriving myself of
Yeah.
it, but I'm not kind of getting sucked into it. It reminds me of that quote for some reason, "It's easier to fool people than convince them that they've been fooled." I forget who
Yeah.
has said that quote,
Yeah.
but,
Yeah. Yeah.
kind of question everything, and I think that definitely connects to optimism, is question the narratives that
Yes.
you're being fed. Who are some of your favorite optimists, throughout history? You mentioned you love history.
Oh, sure.
Your favorite or a couple
Oh, great
favorites?
question. Yeah, again, I think most of the well-known people that you could think of were that, that people always say, MLK said, "I have a dream." He didn't say, "I have a nightmare." And if you listen to the entire "I have a dream" speech, it's a tough speech. I mean, he is not sugarcoating racism and Jim Crow, and it's an incredible speech, but
Right,
it's remembered for "I have a dream," or you know, putting a man on the moon by the end of the decade, JFK, or Dwight Eisenhower during World War II when he's addressing troops on D-Day and he knows best case a lot of these guys aren't going to make it. But his thing was, if I show any vulnerability in this moment, I have to stay optimistic and paint a picture of why this is important and how this is going to lead to future success. Incredible story.
Mm,
Abraham Lincoln, again, back to this. If you want to feel good about where we are today, just study the Civil War.
yeah.
I mean, people say this is the most, seems like almost every 4 years now, this is the most consequential election in American history. Well, how about the year Abraham Lincoln was elected? They had to sneak him into Washington because there were so many assassination plots. The day he got elected, that basically started the Civil War. So he's in Washington, which, by the way, geographically is basically in the South. He's surrounded by enemies. His own son is killed. I mean, it just goes on every day. He's reading about more casualties. Then when they finally win, he has about 2 days to be happy before he's assassinated, celebrating at a theater. So it's all around us. But I think most people you study through history who achieved. Rosa Parks was an optimist. She thought sitting in the front of the bus was actually going to do something, and it did.
Yeah.
So you can't point to a great social movement, I don't think, or entrepreneurs. Not every optimist is an entrepreneur, but every entrepreneur has to be an optimist. And you might like, dislike, or whatever what they created, but they had to have a dream and an optimism, or they wouldn't have done it, and it wouldn't have been successful.
Have you found that optimism is more of a learned behavior, or do you think some people are kind of genetically predisposed to maybe be
Yeah,
more optimistic with, I don't know, chemicals or something in the
I'll
brain?
give you the
I don't
ultimate wishy-washy answer. It's a little bit of both.
know. Okay.
Um, I use the example of athletics. So, I was an athlete growing up, and I was a hockey player primarily, and I could have practiced 24 hours a day, and I was never going to make it to the NHL. I could get better, but I just didn't have that. Versus, I grew up with a guy who had a 19-year Major League Baseball career, and he just had it. He had to keep working, but he had it. So I think it's a little bit of both. There are dispositions that people have that might make them a little bit more negative, a little bit more pessimistic, but you can work at it. And then there's some who, as you know, they just like they came out of the womb that way. It seems
Right.
like
Right.
I was never sure about me because people would ask me a lot, and this is a true story, and I've told it a bunch on my podcast. But um, when I think back to high school, I had a good time, but I remember the sad teenage stuff. And my sister was going through my mom's basement. We were moving her into a different home, and she found my high school yearbook, which I didn't have my senior yearbook. So she hands it to me, and I grab it. And of course, I go to the most likely to, the polling thing.
Yeah.
I don't even remember we did this. Class Optimists. It was me and Maura.
No
We were the class
way.
optimist. This is a goofy picture of me in high school with my thumbs up 40 years ago. I was class optimist. So
Oh
there
my
was something that was a little
gosh.
weird. We haven't put it on social media yet. I gotta get Maura's permission. But
This is
so
long,
I
long
obviously
before your work, right? Long before you
I
did
was
any optimism.
18. I did this 2 years ago. I'm pushing 60. Yeah, no, so that I was like,
Unbelievable.
okay, that's weird. I don't even remember that. But so I think it's a little bit of both, but it's like anything, we can all work on it. And I think it's worthwhile for everyone to work at it because it's good for our health. It's going to be good for society. It's going to be good for our country. It's how progress happens. Kevin Kelly's Twitter thing says the future will be decided by optimists. So I think that's really important, and that's why I do the work I do.
So, so good. And when you feel more optimistic, you help more people. I think that's
Totally.
another thing is, if people are feeling discouraged, like they can't do anything for anybody, you're not going to do anything for anybody, chances are.
Bingo.
Gosh, I enjoyed this conversation so much. Thank you,
Same.
Belle. And
Thank you.
where can people find you, your work, your podcast,
Sure.
all the things?
Sure. So the podcast is called Blue Sky, which I named after the meditation prompt that there's always blue sky above, but sometimes you have to get your head above the clouds to see it. So the Blue
Yeah.
Sky podcast is available wherever you get your podcasts. The entity is the Optimism Institute, somewhat tongue in cheek because you're talking to basically the entire institute. But theoptimisminstitute.com. We have a Blue Sky weekend newsletter once a month. I do a lot of social media. If you go to the Optimism Institute on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, little things in your feed to be encouraging and uplifting. And so it's meant to be sort of a lighter, more positive place on social media. And it's a weekly podcast. So every Wednesday I drop a new episode, as the kids say. And so yeah, I hope people will check it out. And I'm just delighted to have learned about all the work you do, and you bring a sense of optimism and hope to all this too. So there's a lot of
Oh,
us
thank
out there.
you.
So we got to
Yes.
stick together and keep it up.
We all need more of this in our life, and I'm so
Yeah.
glad that you've dedicated an entire institute and a new career
Yes.
path to it.
Thanks, Delanie.
All right, everybody, go check out the Optimism Institute and Blue Sky podcast. And just a heads up, I do want to mention I have been having some audio issues lately in and out on certain episodes. So if you're wondering if I noticed that, yes, I do. I'm in the process of fixing it. I got a new mic. I'm doing all the things. I think some of my equipment may have gotten damaged in my recent move, potentially, or just the room I record in now isn't really optimal for sound, and some of that weird kind of background noise just hasn't been fixable in post. I was considering not mentioning this at all because some people notice and some people don't, and I didn't want to ruin your listening experience. So that is why I decided to share it at the end of an episode, just in case. So please, if you can, bear with me and be optimistic that this will soon be fixed. All right, everybody, I hope you have a good rest of your day, and I'll talk to you soon. So glad you tuned into Self-Helpless. If you felt supported by this or past episodes, there are a couple ways you can help the show. Feel free to share it with a friend who may enjoy the variety of discussions we have here. Also, you can become a monthly or annual supporter of the podcast on Patreon at patreon.com/selfhelpless. That's where you can pitch and vote on topics, submit questions for special guests, or be a silent supporter and not participate in any of that. 100% of Patreon and merch proceeds go directly to operating expenses that not only keep the show going through thick and thin, but also keeps it accessible to all with minimal ads. If you want to show a little extra lovin', you can leave an Apple Podcast review or send an email to share how Self-Helpless has impacted you. All of this info and more goodies can be found at selfhelplesspodcast.com. All right, love you big time, and thank you so much.